This is Parikshit Ghosh from the Delhi School of Economics. On behalf of Ideas for India, today I'm welcoming Professor David Green. David is a professor at the Vancouver School of Economics in the University of British Columbia, and also an international fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. David, thank you very much for sparing us your time today.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here.
So David is a labor economist, primarily. I hate to box you in like that, David, but that is probably your main identity within our discipline. So today I was hoping to pick your brains and seek your opinions and thoughts about a problem which all around the world is recognized to be a major problem, which is rising levels of inequality that we have seen in the last 3 to 4 decades. Let me quickly show a couple of graphs which will illustrate what I'm talking about. So this is the share of income going to the top 10% in the United States. And it's tracked for over a century. This data comes from the very influential work of Piketty, Sayes, and Zucman. And what we see here is that the share of the top 10% came down significantly after the New Deal programs and especially after the war. And it remained low, relatively speaking, historically, till about the beginning of the 80s. And then there's a significant increase once again. And we see similar patterns, if not as pronounced as the United States. So several decades of declining inequality, and it doesn't depend on the measure. You can look at Gini coefficients and other measures. You see a broadly similar pattern, which is decline in the post-war period for about 3 or 4 decades, and then followed by another 4 decades of increasing inequality. So much so that as far as pre-tax income share of the top 10% is concerned, it's almost back to the pre-depression levels. Which is remarkable because Western societies, developed economies have undergone massive changes since the Depression, right? The welfare state came in and all kinds of taxes and transfers were brought in. So this is the focus, or at least the launching pad for our discussion today, David. So people have been talking about what may have caused this dramatic shift in the last 4 decades. One usual suspect is, of course, trade and globalization. Another possibility is immigration, and in some of the political debates that plays a prominent role. Then there's automation. More jobs are being automated. Machines are replacing humans, so that could be one of the forces. And then people talk about various policy changes since the Reagan-Thatcher era. Policies have drifted to the right. There's been a decline in union power. Taxes and transfers, social programs have been cut, and so on. So my first broad question to you is, as someone who has studied these labor markets, the Canadian labor market in particular, but also US and mature economies labor markets for the last several decades, how do you see as the cause behind this rising inequality?
I think one of the things that's interesting when you get into this area is some of the things that economists, or at least empirical economists, think they know. I think some of them would be surprising to sort of regular people on the street. So a good example of that one is the immigration one, which, as you said, the particularly sort of right-wing populists have really taken that on, made it a focus of blame, the sort of argument that immigrants come in and they steal jobs is the phrase used, and lower wages. I think surprisingly to a lot of people, the consensus in economics is that immigration has almost no effect, at least in the medium term. And a lot of that comes from evidence based on examining cities and states. What happened to wages and employment after you had a big influx of immigration? And the grandparent of this whole literature, the starting point is a paper by David Card from Berkeley about the Mariel boat lift. In about 1980, Fidel Castro suddenly said everybody can leave who wants to leave, but there was no real way for them to leave Cuba. But so what happened over the next 5 months is people got on anything that floated and lots of things that didn't float and tried to get across to Miami. And then from the other side, from Miami, came a flotilla of boats that picked them up. And in that 5-month period before Castro closed the door again, the Miami labor force increased by 7% in a 5-month period, which is astronomically large for immigration inflows. And then what David did was he basically tracked forward and said, well, what happened in Miami versus other cities that looked a lot like Miami beforehand? And what you find is in Miami, wages went down during the first year, but they recovered. And by about 3 years out, which really think about this is not very long out, but employment rates were back to where they were relative to the other places. Wages were back to where they were. There was almost no evidence of a particularly big negative impact. And that finding has been replicated in various different settings in various different countries, dictates the way economists, labor economists at least, look at immigration now. So this argument that immigration is this huge negative force that's driving inequality in developed economies, there's just no evidence for it. On the other hand, the people who claim that immigration is the savior of the economy, there's no great evidence for that either. But that's just one example of how, the evidence is somewhat different from what I think people sometimes think.
Isn't there a bit of a debate among labor economists, especially, George Borjas, his view that very unskilled labor, they are hurt by immigration because they are the ones who are facing competition from the immigrants. In the Miami example, most of the immigrants were low skilled. So if you decompose the effects and look at the unskilled workers, people working in restaurants and stuff like that, don't we find an effect there?
It's a good point. There's part that sort of gets into the nitty gritty of that literature. So it's true, George Borjas wrote a paper that said almost exactly what you said in the Miami labor force by using somewhat different techniques. Giovanni Perry from UC Davis wrote quite a strong rebuttal of that Borjas point in that particular context. Now, with that said, there is also evidence that, as you're saying, it's uneven what happens to wages overall when immigration comes in. It turns out that the main negative impact on wages is for previously arrived immigrants. What really seems to happen is that lower skilled native born shift towards jobs where the host country language is important. So they'll shift to ones that are more sort of front facing in shops. The immigrants pick up the jobs where immigration is less important. And who are they competing with on those jobs? Well, previously arrived immigrants. So there is a sort of evidence that there's a negative impact. It's very localized in a sense within the economy.
Right, that makes sense. But anyway, the international movement of people is very limited, right? It's much smaller in volume than the movement of goods. So what do you think has been the impact of trade and also technological change like automation in the
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, I think trade is, and I'm really interested to hear what you think, but trade is a particularly complex one, right? So there have been a whole set of studies looking at what happened when trade for China opened up really substantially around 2000. And what the evidence there is, particularly in parts of the US and other developed economies where there was a real concentration of manufacturing, of industries that were going to compete directly with China, there you see falls in employment, falls in wages. And that often, I think, sort of takes over the conversation. People say, okay, so trade is this inequality inducing thing. But I think it's important to think about the other side of trade, who's benefiting from this trade in terms of the workers who are doing the work that's now being sold. On a global level, one would say that at the very least, it's not unsure, and I think probably more in the direction of trade being a positive force for reducing inequality on a global level. Then there's other complications, right? So one of the things trade does is it reduces the cost, and particularly it's reduced the cost of of goods that are produced with more low-skilled labor. Well, who buys that? Those goods, well, it tends to be people who have lower incomes, even in the developed economy. So trades had this sort of subtle impact of keeping the cost of living down. So that's working against these wage loss issues. And then finally, there are economies, for example, after about 2000, Canada's inequality trend goes flat. And as far as I know, Australia does the same. And a lot of what was happening there is Canada really benefited from being able to sell resources in a hot resource market. So trade in that sense really brought wages up in Canada and employment up, and the same in Australia. And so in Canada, 2000s was actually quite a good labor market decade when it was a disastrous one in the US. So it's sort of like trade is a very complex force, honestly.
So in the US also, natural resource extraction picked up in the last 20 years, right? All the fracking and the shale oil. So it wasn't enough in the US to compensate, or those opportunities came out elsewhere, like in the Midwestern Rust Belt got hollowed out, but all the fracking was happening in Arizona and Texas and places like that.
That's a good point. I think there's a couple of things. One is the US is just not nearly as resource developed an economy as Canada and Australia. You're right. They definitely benefited from those trends. It just wasn't as important for the economy as a whole. I've worked on some papers that suggest that when you get something like a fracking boom in one part of the economy, it does reach over to other parts of the economy. That is, workers move from the Rust Belt, and that has benefits even back in the Rust Belt. It's just sort of not big enough relative to the whole size of the American economy to undo what was being done in the manufacturing sector. That was my take on it. So some economies were net winners from what happened in the resource boom and the expansion of trade in the 2000s. The US was a net loser. And one of the things that happens is we all tend to focus on the US. Like it's sort of the center of our profession. It's also, the thing that we all read about. Everybody pays attention to their sports and their music. So somehow or another, it looms super large. When you look at some of these issues, they're not quite the same in the rest of the world.
In this context, the whole discourse, both in theory as well as in, sort of empirical understanding of what's going on, our theory tells us that things like international trade with regard to comparative advantage and everything, those increase the size of the pie. But then, as a rejoinder, theory also tells us that beware of distributive effects, right? There will be winners and losers, and we have to somehow handle that. Now, some of the forces of what we're talking about, what has happened in the US economy, I have to take that as the leading example, although we were sort of warning against that, is that, some regions went into decline. So the Midwest, the Rust Belt really went into a deep decline. But then some other regions have prospered, like Silicon Valley, the Western United States, and more recently the South, right? That's prospering and coming up. And I guess you see this reflected in voting patterns too, Democrat, Republican divide. Now, of course, in a frictionless world where people could reinvent themselves and move, right, from the declining regions to the prosperous, if they can move from the Rust Belt to the Silicon Valley and reinvent themselves from factory workers, welders to software programmers, then the distribution wouldn't be a problem. So my question to you as somebody who studied labor market for a long time, how much friction is there on these two fronts? Geographical mobility, people moving around to take advantage of the opportunities arising elsewhere, and people's ability to shift occupations, professions, reinvent their skills, and so on.
Both are really important. My belief is there's very considerable frictions in both of those. I think one of the things that we tend to underplay in economics that I think most people recognize as obvious is the importance of communities. And so you get in these situations where people are not willing to make those geographic moves you're talking about because of the communities are so important. So there's an old literature actually that looked at the question of welfare magnets and do people move in order to go and get better welfare benefits. This is actually a largely US literature, but they looked at places where you looked right along a state border and you could see people living in, I think it was Michigan, where the benefits were not very good. And by moving like 20 miles, they could have been in Wisconsin where the benefits were quite good. And you see very little movement of that kind. And then when you go and talk to people and ask what's going on, well, the answer is really, I get a lot of support from my community. Like my parents take care of my child when I have to suddenly work an odd shift and somebody else gives me food. And so all of those things hold people in place. And that means that the kinds of Ricardian forces you're talking about are very long-term forces. And when we count the costs of trade, we should be taking those long-term transitions into account. There's an interesting example. Canada has a free trade agreement with the US. When that was first initiated, there was this sort of recognition that there would be winners and losers. And so they set up a fund, which was officially so that anyone who lost their job because of the trade would get retraining, would get money to be, moved somewhere else. And that fund was almost never used because nobody could really prove who had lost their job due to trade. So there was sort of this beforehand recognition, but after the fact, the inequality in impacts happened nonetheless.
Right. Just as an aside, David, when this NAFTA was being signed, right? This is the early days of the Clinton administration. Remember that Ross Perot had a debate with Al Gore,
Right.
American television. I was a graduate student then, and it was fascinating. Public policy was being debated in such a prominent way. And Ross Perot said that jobs will disappear south of the border. He was referring to Mexico. Because that was a lower age economy, that jobs will disappear with a sucking sound, right? The folksy Texan way of speaking. And I was in an economics department and everybody just looked at him with contempt, of course. And I think the educated class in general. But I guess, with the last 30 years of debate about trade and some of the China shock and these sorts of things, maybe there's history should reevaluate Ross Perot to some degree, wouldn't you say?
I don't think I'm going to put him on a pedestal, but I think you're right. I think it's very interesting because in the NAFTA debate on the Canadian side of the border, so there's a free trade agreement that precedes NAFTA by about 10 years. And then NAFTA then brought Mexico in and expanded things and everything. But in that original debate, there was almost no discussion about that distributional side of things. There was a set of people actually at UBC who were trying to talk about it. So like Brian Copeland was really trying to talk about this and get attention for this. But everybody else was buried in these models that you were talking about, where it's like, no, we'll make the pie bigger. Everyone will be better in general, and we'll figure out how to worry about any losers later on. And I think you're right that the economics profession as a whole has come to a greater appreciation of the importance of the distributional problems, and that China shock part of the literature has really, elevated Ross Perot, if you want, although I don't think they reference him very much.
Strange, right? If you look at the standard international trade that we teach in our programs, right? This is mainstream lecture only in theory. And that tells us already that there will be winners and losers. There will be massive shifts in factor prices. If a developed country is trading with an underdeveloped world where relatively wages are lower, then it will have a wage depressing effect. It's somehow we thought that it was of second order importance. That we'll get to that later. Let's increase the size of the pie, and then that's of first order importance. And then there was this survey done by Arjo Kramer. Do you remember that? Sort of opinions of economists.
Yeah.
Kind of yes, no questions, right? And there was one, is trade a good thing or a bad thing? I think something like 94% of academic economists said yes. Today, if that question were asked to me, I would refuse to answer it.
Yeah.
There would be important qualifiers and caveats.
I think that's a completely reasonable thing to say. I think one of the things that we've come to recognize or placed at the center that we didn't used to have at the center as much is what you called frictions, like these kinds of things that keep people from adjusting, whether it's personal ties, whether it's I don't leave this job to go to the other job because I know I'm going to have this period of trying to find a new job and it's hard to do and that's costly, and that creates what we call friction, keeps people in place to some degree. And there's been a whole set of models, not just in trade, but really in labor economics and studying labor markets in a big way, that's about, okay, if we integrate this idea of frictions, how does that change our view of how workers and firms interact? And it turns out to have really profound implications, including, as you're saying, a much more nuanced view of trade.
Right. So these frictions and these distributive effects really lesson from the last 30 years is that we need to take them more seriously. Let me get to another issue, David. This inequality which has come up in the last 3-4 decades, part of it is inequality among workers, right? So there's a higher college premium. Skilled workers are earning more and unskilled workers are falling behind, broadly speaking. And the other component of this inequality is that capitalists, the division of GDP between a labor share and a capital share, that has also been moving around. So let me show our viewers a couple of graphs. So this one is the real wages of workers at various education levels. The left panel is for men, the right panel is for women. What is obvious is that the most highly educated workers have actually done well so far, right, on average. People with master's degree and similar, they've had a steep increase. And as you go down the education ladder, the more flatter is the wage trajectory for the last 30, 40 years. And especially for the very low, less educated, less skilled workers, it has even declined a bit. And similar patterns for women. Wage inequality has gone up within the laboring class. But also, I looked up numbers about what fraction of GDP goes to labor as a whole, of all kinds, college educated, non-college educated. And that seems to be on the decline. So this figure is taken from the St. Louis Fed. And I understand there's some issue about how to measure capital. But nevertheless, you take it from a respectable source, what I see again is a declining trend. So in the beginning of this phase of inequality, labor was earning about 2/3 of GDP. And now it's down to almost 60%. Right? So that, if true, would be a pretty significant drop. So how do you see this? Do you see both standing today as well as kind of looking into the future, that a big driver, I mean, of course, both have happened to some degree, but do you see the inequality, the skill premium as the more important part of it? Or do you see the shift of labor share towards capital to be the bigger, more concerning force?
Interesting. I didn't really make that comparison so sharply between the two possibilities. This is the labor share for Canada. Okay. Now, if you start here, like say 1980, then you would say, okay, here too, we've seen this decline. Although actually labor share since about 2004 has been on the increase in Canada. If you look at the UK, it's actually on the increase since about the late 90s. And over the very long haul, so this is what you were saying before, there's different ways you can handle labor share. One of the big problems in measuring labor share is what to do with the self-employed, whose income is partially capital income and partially labor income. And so there's different ways of dealing with that problem. And this is just one way. And that's why it's not on the exactly same level as the US. It should be roughly, but you can see we're actually now, by the time you reach post the last big recession, we're back where we were in the 1960s. So this historic long-term decline is not true in Canada. It's also not true in the UK. It's a very US thing, this notion that labor share over the long haul is really declining. Now, it's important because historically, economists have looked at the labor share and assumed like it was so rock solid, it didn't move very much for a long time, that it was actually built deep into theories. A whole bunch of macro theories were built around this notion that the labor share didn't move. You can see here that it at least swings in Canada, and it's on this sort of long-term decline in the US. The reason I bring up the other countries is because one of the big explanations for this that's been promoted, particularly in the US, is this idea of technological change. And the technological change is in principle going to show up in both places of the figures that you showed up, right? It's sort of like, on the one hand, bringing in these new sort of computer-based technologies, it's the skilled workers who work with them best. They, in some sense, replace the jobs of the less skilled workers. And so then you get that fanning out pattern that you were showing. And at the same time, in principle, depending on how it works exactly, it could lead to lower labor share. And that's led some people to declare that we're on a path for labor share going to zero. And so I view both of them as being driven by the same force. I don't really view one as way more important than the other. I see them as really connected. And trying to understand how they're moving differently across economies is one way of trying to understand how much of this is, in some sense, policy related, back to Four Horsemen or whatever, and how much of this is driven by technology. One of the things that I feel is problematic about the way technological change is often discussed, as if it's this exogenous force that is out of our control and is going to take over our labor markets. And that US labor trend share has really helped promote that idea. It's like over this long haul, it's been on the decline. It doesn't seem to be slowing down. This is technology taking over. And I think that's when you sort of see how things move in different economies, you start realizing, well, this can't really be true. Canada, the US, the UK are such similar economies. For them to be on different patterns on this labor share suggests it's something not quite like technological change explained that way, at least. My short answer to your question is sort of like, I view both of them as important. And I think trying to understand how they're tied together is important for understanding what the forces are that are driving them.
So I think that gives me an opportunity to talk about one of the papers which I found fascinating. Your paper on whether the demand for cognitive tasks is falling off. This is your paper in the Journal of Labor Economics 2014. So this is one picture from the paper, which broadly speaking gives us the relative demand and supply growth for high-level skilled jobs, which require college degrees and higher. The supply of these grew at a steady clip, and the gap between demand and supply narrowed by your estimation. But around 2000, there was a reversal, that the demand for these sort of high cognitive tasks flattened out and supply exceeded it. And there are other interesting graphs in that paper. For example, what kind of tasks are college graduates doing? Are they doing cognitively intense kind of tasks? And that increased in 2000, but has been declining since then, whereas manual tasks are increasing even for college graduates. So what I took away from the paper is that you're saying that there was this sort of massive technological change, especially in the 90s, the computer revolution, etc. So that created a higher demand for these cognitive tasks and jobs, but then it kind of saturated, right? And then it tapered off because the technology matured and things were put in place. And so that has actually led to some sort of reversal. And I found that surprising because the broad brushstrokes picture is that, the world is moving in a direction where every next day you got more cognitive powers, more education, etc., to be able to compete in the job market and get a decent wage. So what's your thoughts on that paper and the issues there?
I completely agree with you. We all have this feeling things are changing constantly. There are, more advanced technologies coming on. And yet this figure is interesting because we ended up talking to a number of different journalists at the time this paper came out. It sort of caught a little bit of attention. And I remember talking to several of them who caught on this figure, and they're like, yes, this is what's going on to my kids, right? My kids are graduating college and they're getting jobs in Starbucks. I thought the point was they were all going to get these great high-tech jobs and they were going to be, making money hand over fist. But instead, my kids are in these other jobs that aren't those jobs that seems like the university education was for. And so this paper comes from trying to understand those two facts at the same time, right? If you talk to people, they'll say, yeah, college graduates have it hard these days. It was harder than when we graduated. On the other hand, there's this sort of expansion. So our explanation for that has a lot to do with trying to kind of, in a different sense, reverse the dialogue, the way that people talk about technology and the labor market. Like I said, it's very common to talk about it as if it's an exogenous force. And like the engineers in Silicon Valley talk about it that way. It's like, we will be able to, have robots do everything. We will be able to figure out how AI does everything. And so there's this sort of notion that if the technology grows, it'll just take over everything in this unstoppable force. But in fact, we know that a lot of this is actually governed by economics. And so, for example, the phone in your pocket is not built by robots. It's built by low-skilled labor. And why is that? Because it's not because they couldn't build it with robots. That almost certainly is possible at this point. But the economic forces don't go that way. And in this case, what we're looking at is saying, okay, when these technologies came on, this really big overall technology, okay, this big notion of using computers for computing power for things, we had to really reorganize everything, right? You can remember times when there were more secretaries, for example. So you had to basically completely rewrite offices. You didn't just fire the secretaries and computers were in place the next day. Somebody had to come in, set up the whole infrastructure. There were people who were expert in how this would interact. Web pages used to be hard to create. There was all kinds of work that was needed to set this technology up. There's other examples of these big technologies coming in. When electrification was created, huge burst in work that was related to that, right? So setting up the wires, doing everything to build the infrastructure. No one would claim, we certainly wouldn't claim that was it. The electrification revolution stopped the day all the wires were up. It had big knock-on effects, but that first really big burst of the setting up stage had passed. And that's the way we see this as well. It's sort of what the 90s are, is this really big reworking of the whole economy. This is the US again, by the way. Having set that up, you now are in this situation where people were training thinking, okay, I'm going to be a software developer and this is going to be a high paying job. You get into the next stage where this is now done. We've automated some of the software writing, and all of a sudden you find that the demand for these skills is not as high as you thought it was. It goes down from the trend. And that's the point of this paper. It's like when you actually look hard at this labor market, back to your figure before, only the people at the very top now are doing well. If you figure you showed before where it was fanning out, if you looked at the line with the bachelor's degree in the left figure there and notice how flat that line goes after 2000. There's this sort of notion that the university educated have been doing so super well. Part of it has, but let's be clear, it's not necessarily a very big share of the workforce. The whole lower part is moving fairly in parallel. Bachelors are doing better, as you point out, than the really low educated, but not way, way better. And that was kind of the point of our paper. How can this be? How can we be talking about this thing that supposedly is really favoring the university educated, and at the same time have people talk about how their kids can't find good jobs coming out with a university degree? And our answer to that was essentially that you've reached a stage now in the development of this big technology that it is making new advances, but it's not at the same pace as we saw in the 90s. It's not having to rebuild the whole infrastructure as it was before.